Do you want to lose $500 million or just 5 seconds? The pen was still in Daniel Whitmore's hand when the voice reached him, soft, steady, and completely out of place in a room where every second was worth more than most people made in a year. He didn't look up at first. Men like him didn't pause for interruptions, especially not from someone who wasn't even part of the conversation. Around the long glass table, executives leaned forward, suits crisp, watches gleaming, eyes fixed on the contract that would finalize one of the largest acquisitions of the quarter. $500 million. Numbers like that didn't just move markets. They defined legacies. Daniel signed his name with practiced precision, the ink flowing smoothly across the page, applause already beginning to rise in polite, controlled bursts. The deal was done. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Everyone except her. Emily Carter stood a few feet behind him, a tray balanced effortlessly in her hand, untouched glasses of sparkling water catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. She hadn't moved in nearly a minute. Not since the number flashed across the screen. Not since her eyes stopped. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. A decimal buried deep inside a projection model. A shift so small it looked harmless. Insignificant. But Emily didn't see numbers the way most people did. To her, they spoke. Patterns. Weight. Consequence. And that number was wrong. She lowered the tray slowly, setting it on the side table without a sound. No one noticed. Why would they? She was just the waitress. Invisible by design. Replaceable by assumption. Daniel finally glanced up, irritation flickering across his face at the break in rhythm. What is it? He asked, his tone controlled but sharp, the kind that made most people step back without thinking. Emily met his gaze, not challenging, not submissive, just calm. Do you want to lose $500 million or 5 seconds? The room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. A few heads turned. A few brows tightened. Daniel's hand paused above the paper. For the first time in the meeting, he looked at her. Really looked. Not the uniform. Not the role. Her eyes. Steady. Certain. Unshaken by the weight of the room. Excuse me, he said, quieter now. Emily stepped forward, just one step, keeping her voice even. The adjustment factor in your projection model, she said, nodding slightly toward the screen. It's off by 0.7%. It doesn't look like much, but over 6 months, compounded through your exposure. She stopped, just for a breath. Not hesitation. Precision. It turns your profit into a loss. Silence. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Silence. The kind that settles when something lands too clearly to ignore. Daniel's eyes moved to the screen. Then back to her. Then back again. No one spoke. No one moved. The applause had died before it ever fully formed. Somewhere in the room, a chair shifted softly against the floor. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. It's not a rounding error, she added, almost gently. It's a trap. And just like that, the most powerful man in the room stopped signing. Daniel did not speak right away. And that was the first signal that something had shifted because men like him always had an answer ready. Always controlled the pace of the room. But now his eyes remained fixed on the screen, as if the numbers had suddenly become unfamiliar, as if they had betrayed him in plain sight. And slowly he set the pen down on the table with a soft, deliberate movement that echoed louder than any voice in the room. Show me, he said, not to his team, not to the executives who had spent weeks preparing this deal, but to her, the waitress standing where she should not have been. And for a brief moment no one moved because no one quite understood what was happening, until Emily reached for a blank sheet of paper near the edge of the table, her fingers steady, her posture calm, and she began to write, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, each number placed with intention, each line connecting to the next like it had been there all along waiting to be seen. Your model assumes stability in the secondary market, she said quietly, her voice carrying without effort. But the adjustment factor here is applied before volatility correction, not after. She circled a small figure, almost invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. That shifts your baseline. Daniel leaned forward now, his attention fully captured, the room fading around him. And when you scale it across your exposure, she continued, sliding the paper slightly toward him. The margin you think you are gaining starts reversing by the second quarter. One of the senior analysts frowned, stepping closer. That is not possible, We ran this model 3 times, he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried just minutes ago. Emily did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Daniel. You ran it correctly, she replied. But you trusted the input too early. The words landed softly, but they cut through the air with clarity. Daniel's gaze moved from her handwriting to the projection on the screen, then back again, his mind recalculating, adjusting, aligning. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle tightening of his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes. Recognition. Run it again, he said, his voice low, controlled, but different now. One of the analysts hesitated, then quickly moved to the laptop, fingers tapping faster than before. The room holding its breath as the numbers recalculated, line by line, assumption by assumption. And for the first time since the meeting began, uncertainty entered the space. Not chaos, not panic, just the quiet realization that something had been missed, something important, something expensive. The screen refreshed, new figures appearing where the old ones had stood so confidently just moments ago, and no one spoke because they all saw it at the same time. The shift, small at first, then growing, compounding, turning projected profit into something else entirely. Daniel leaned back, slightly, exhaling through his nose. Not anger, not frustration, just acceptance of a truth that could not be ignored. His eyes lifted to Emily again, studying her now with a different kind of attention, not dismissal, not curiosity, something closer to respect. Where did you learn to see that? He asked, and for the first time, the question in the room was not about the deal, not about the money, but about her. Emily paused just long enough to make it clear that she was choosing whether to answer. Then she gave the smallest hint of a smile, not proud, not shy, just knowing. The same place you did, she said quietly, just from a different seat. No one asked her to leave, and that alone was unusual because rooms like this had rules that were rarely spoken but always enforced, and she had already crossed one simply by speaking, yet no one stopped her. No. One redirected her, because the numbers on the screen had just rewritten the authority in the room, and Daniel Whitmore was still looking at her like she was no longer invisible, like she had stepped out of the background and into something he could not easily categorize. He stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the weight of the moment, and the executives around the table straightened instinctively, waiting for his next move. Delay the signing, he said, his voice calm but final, the kind that did not invite discussion. The legal team exchanged quick glances, one of them carefully closing the contract folder as if it had suddenly become fragile. We need to review the model from the ground up, Daniel added. And that was when the tension truly settled in. Not panic, not chaos, but the quiet understanding that something worth $500 million had just been pulled back from the edge by someone who was not even supposed to be in the conversation. Emily stepped back slightly, not retreating, just returning to where she had been, her role, her place, but it did not feel the same anymore. The room had changed, or maybe the way they saw her had. One of the senior partners cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect, we have spent weeks validating these projections. Daniel did not look at him, his attention still anchored on Emily. And she corrected them in under a minute, he replied. Not harsh, not confrontational, just factual. And that was enough to end the discussion. Silence followed again, heavier this time, filled with recalculations that were no longer just about numbers. Emily reached for her tray, lifting it with the same steady motion she had used 100 times before, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just altered the outcome of a deal that would be discussed in boardrooms across the country. She turned slightly, ready to step away, to disappear back into the rhythm of service. But Daniel's voice stopped her. Wait. It was not a command, not exactly. More like a request he was not used to making. She paused, glancing back, her expression unchanged, calm, composed. You saw that in seconds, he said, studying her carefully. Before anyone else in this room. Emily tilted her head just slightly, considering the question behind his words rather than the words themselves. I was not looking for approval, she said quietly. I was looking at the pattern. Daniel's brow tightened, not in confusion, but in recognition of something he understood too well. Patterns were what built empires, what protected them, what destroyed them when ignored. He took a step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel private even in a room full of people. And what else? Do you see? He asked, and for a moment, just a brief moment, something shifted in Emily's eyes. Not hesitation, not fear, something deeper, like a door that had been closed for a long time being considered. Then she looked past him, at the screen, at the recalculated numbers, at the executives who were now avoiding her gaze, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible exhale. I see a company that almost trusted the wrong assumption, she said, her voice soft but clear, and a room full of people who are not used to being wrong. No one argued, because no one could. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, slowly, not as a dismissal, not as permission, but as acknowledgement, the kind that carried weight, the kind that did not need to be explained, and Emily turned away again. This time no one stopped her, but no one forgot her either, because in less than a minute, she had done something none of them had expected. She had not raised her voice, she had not challenged authority, she had simply changed the outcome, and that was something far more difficult to ignore. The room did not return to normal after she left. It could not, because something invisible had been rearranged and no one could quite name it. The numbers on the screen were still there, but they no longer carried the same authority. They had been questioned, corrected, exposed, and that kind of shift did not fade quietly. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the doorway Emily had just passed through, as if the answer to a question he had not yet fully formed was somewhere just beyond it. Then he turned back to the table. I want every assumption in this model reviewed, he said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a new edge, not impatience, not frustration, something sharper, awareness. The analysts moved quickly now, no hesitation, no overconfidence, just focus, fingers moving across keyboards, recalculating, verifying, double-checking what they had previously trusted without question. One of the partners leaned forward, lowering his voice. Daniel, with all due respect, we cannot base a decision like this on a comment from a waitress. Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply looked at the man, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with a kind of clarity that made the rest of the sentence unnecessary. We are not basing it on her title, he said finally. We are basing it on the fact that she was right. The words settled into the room with weight, heavier than any argument, because they were simple, and simplicity in a room full of complex people was difficult to challenge. The partner leaned back, silent now, while on the screen the updated projections continued to unfold, each recalculated line confirming what Emily had already seen in seconds, the margin shrinking, the risk expanding, the deal unraveling in quiet, undeniable increments. Daniel watched it all without speaking, his mind not just processing the numbers, but replaying the moment, the way she had stepped forward, the way she had not rushed, not hesitated, not tried to prove anything beyond what was already true. And that was what unsettled him the most. Not that she had seen the mistake, but that she had seen it without needing validation. Sir, one of the analysts said carefully, if we proceed under these corrected assumptions, the projected loss exceeds $480 million within the first fiscal cycle. Daniel nodded once, not surprised, just confirming what he already knew. Then we are not proceeding, he replied. And just like that, $500 million shifted direction, not with a dramatic announcement, not with raised voices, but with a quiet decision that would never make headlines yet would define everything that followed. The legal team began gathering the documents, the tension easing slightly, replaced by something else, something closer to humility, though no one would say it out loud. Daniel reached for the sheet of paper Emily had written on, lifting it carefully, studying the numbers again, the handwriting, precise, efficient, no unnecessary marks, just clarity. He turned it slightly, as if looking at it from another angle might reveal something more. Find out who she is, he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for his assistant to hear. She nodded immediately, already making a note, but Daniel's attention had already moved beyond the room, beyond the deal, beyond the numbers, to something far less predictable, because for the first time in a long time, he had encountered something he could not immediately quantify, not a market trend, not a competitor, not a risk factor, but a person. And as the room slowly returned to motion, conversations resuming in quieter tones. Daniel Whitmore stood still for just a second longer, holding a single sheet of paper that had changed everything, and realizing that the most valuable insight in the room had not come from the people he had hired, but from the one person he had almost ignored. The meeting ended without celebration, without handshakes, without the usual quiet confidence that followed a deal of that size. Instead, there was a different kind of energy, restrained, thoughtful, as if everyone had been reminded of something they had forgotten. Daniel walked out of the room last, the paper still in his hand, his assistant a step behind him, already scanning messages, coordinating calls, adjusting schedules that no longer made sense. Reschedule the investor briefing, he said without slowing down. And clear my next hour. She nodded, typing quickly, but her eyes flickered toward the paper he was holding, curiosity barely contained. Yes, sir, she replied. And that was all. No questions, no assumptions, just execution. The hallway outside the conference room was quieter, softer, the hum of the building replacing the tension of the meeting, but Daniel's pace did not change. If anything, it sharpened, focused. He turned a corner, then another, until the polished glass and steel gave way to something warmer. The restaurant space below, where the air carried the faint scent of coffee and conversation, where deals were discussed more casually, where people like Emily moved without being noticed. He stopped at the edge of the room, scanning without making it obvious, tables filled with guests, servers moving in practiced rhythm, trays balanced, orders delivered, nothing out of place, nothing unusual. Except now he was looking differently, not for service, not for efficiency, but for her. Emily Carter moved between tables with the same quiet precision she had shown in the conference room, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just altered the trajectory of a $500 million decision. She placed a plate down, adjusted a glass slightly, nodded politely to a customer, then turned, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, not dramatic, not charged, just recognition. Daniel walked toward her, not rushed, not hesitant, just direct, and that alone was enough to shift the air around them. A few nearby guests glanced up, sensing the change without understanding it. Emily finished what she was doing before acknowledging him, setting the tray down, aligning the edge of a napkin, then turning fully. Sir, she said, her tone the same as before, professional, composed, as if he were just another customer. Daniel studied her for a second, not evaluating, not measuring, just observing. You left before we finished the conversation, he said, not accusing, just stating. Emily tilted her head slightly, a faint hint of something in her expression, not amusement, not defiance, something quieter. The conversation in that room was not mine to finish, she replied. Daniel glanced briefly around the restaurant, then back at her. You changed the outcome, he said. That makes it yours, at least partially. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply reached for a glass, adjusting it by a fraction of an inch, a small action, but deliberate, grounding. I corrected a number, she said softly. What you do with it is yours. Daniel let that settle, the simplicity of it, the absence of any attempt to claim credit. And that was what held his attention more than anything else. Where did you learn to see things like that? He asked again. But this time the question carried more weight, more intention. Emily met his gaze, steady as before, but this time there was something else behind it, something measured, something chosen. You already asked me that, she said, and Daniel nodded slightly. And you gave me an answer that sounded like a deflection. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then looked past him, at the room, at the people who still moved without noticing. Or maybe, she said quietly, it just was not the answer you were expecting. And for the first time, Daniel Whitmore, a man who built his world on predictability, realized that he was no longer in control of this conversation, and strangely, he did not try to take it back. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that was becoming a pattern now, not hesitation, but consideration, something he rarely allowed himself in conversations that used to move entirely on his terms. The noise of the restaurant continued around them, glasses clinking softly, quiet conversations weaving through the air, but it all felt distant, like a backdrop that no longer held his attention. You saw something my entire team missed, he said finally, his voice lower now, less about authority and more about clarity. That is not coincidence. Emily picked up her tray again, balancing it with effortless precision, her movements unchanged, grounded in routine. No, she said simply. It is not. Daniel watched her for a moment, studying the ease in her posture, the absence of any need to prove herself further, and that absence made the truth harder to ignore. Then why are you here? He asked, not sharply, not accusing, just direct, the question that had been forming since. The moment she spoke in the conference room, Emily paused, just briefly, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was deciding whether he needed to hear it. She set a glass down on a nearby table, aligning it with the edge in a small, deliberate motion, then turned back to him. Because this is where I am right now, she said, her tone even, not defensive, not revealing more than necessary. Daniel exhaled slowly, not frustration, but recognition that she was not going to give him more than she chose to. And that, too, was unfamiliar. That is not what I meant, he said, stepping slightly closer, lowering his voice so it stayed between them. People who see patterns like that do not usually carry trays. Emily met his gaze, steady, unshaken, and people who sign contracts like that do not usually miss them. She replied, not as a challenge, not as a criticism, just a statement placed carefully between them. Daniel did not flinch, but something in his expression shifted. Not offense, not pride, something quieter, acceptance, fair, he said after a moment. And for the first time, there was a faint trace of something almost like a smile, not visible to most, but there, subtle, controlled. Still, he continued, I would like to understand how you got from there to here. Emily glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him. Measuring time, responsibility, reality. Understanding is expensive, she said softly. Most people are not actually asking for it. Daniel's brow lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in interest. And I am not most people, he said. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, as if weighing that statement, then gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not yet, just acknowledgement. No, she said, you are not. A server passed behind her, brushing lightly against her shoulder, pulling her attention back to the rhythm of the room. She adjusted her grip on the tray, grounding herself again. I have tables waiting, she added, her voice returning fully to its professional tone. Daniel glanced briefly around, as if seeing the space for what it was, not a boardroom, not a place where time bent around him, but a place where other people existed, with their own expectations, their own timelines, and for once, he did not interrupt that. He stepped back slightly, creating space instead of taking it. Then I will wait, he said, simple, direct. And that was the moment something subtle but important shifted again, because waiting was not something Daniel Whitmore did, not for meetings, not for people, not for answers. But now he stood there, watching as Emily turned away, moving back into the flow of the restaurant, serving, listening, adjusting, unnoticed by most, and yet impossible for him to ignore, because now he understood something he had not before, that the most valuable insight he had encountered that day was not in a report, not in a model, not in a room full of experts, but in someone who had learned to see without being seen. And that kind of perspective was not easily replaced, not easily forgotten, and definitely not something he was willing to walk away from. Daniel did not check his watch, and that alone would have surprised anyone who knew him, because time, to him, had always been a resource to control, to optimize, to compress into measurable outcomes. But now he stood near the edge of the restaurant, still, observing, not impatient, not distracted, just present. His assistant lingered a few steps behind, unsure whether to interrupt or adjust his schedule further. But something in his posture made her pause, as if even she understood that this moment did not follow the usual rules. Across the room, Emily moved with quiet efficiency, refilling a glass before it was empty, adjusting a chair before it became uncomfortable, anticipating without asking. The kind of awareness that came from paying attention when no one expected you to. And Daniel saw it now, not as service, but as pattern recognition. The same skill that had stopped him from making the most expensive mistake of the quarter, just applied in a different environment, a different scale, a different kind of consequence. He watched as she interacted with a couple, seated near the window, her tone warm but measured, her words few but exact, and the way she listened, fully, without interrupting, without rushing. It was the same precision she had used in the conference room, just quieter, less visible. "She does not miss anything," he said under his breath. Almost to himself, his assistant glanced at him, then followed his gaze, seeing only a waitress doing her job, but sensing that he was seeing something else entirely. Minutes passed, not wasted, just unfolding, until Emily finally stepped away from her section, placing her tray down near the service station, wiping her hands lightly on a cloth, grounding herself before turning back toward him. She did not rush, did not acknowledge the waiting as something unusual. She simply walked over, stopping at a respectful distance. "You waited," she said, not surprised, just noting it. Daniel gave a small nod. "You said you had tables," he replied, as if that explained everything, and in a way it did. Emily studied him for a second, the slightest shift in her expression suggesting that she recognized the effort behind something so simple. "Most people would not," she said quietly. Daniel allowed a brief pause, not to fill the silence, but to let it settle. "Most people did not just save me $500 million, he answered. And again, there was no exaggeration in his tone, just fact. Emily exhaled softly, not dismissing the statement, but not holding on to it either. "You would have caught it eventually," she said, and Daniel shook his head once, subtle, certain. "Not before it cost me," he replied. And that was the difference, not intelligence, not capability, but timing. Emily glanced toward the window, the light shifting slightly as the afternoon moved forward, then back to him. "So," she said, her voice steady, "what exactly are you waiting for now?" Daniel met her gaze directly. No longer analyzing, no longer measuring, just asking. "The part you did not say," he answered. Emily's eyes held his for a moment longer this time, longer than before, as if something was being considered more seriously, more carefully. The noise of the restaurant faded again, not because it stopped, but because it no longer mattered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was just as calm as before, but carried something deeper, something chosen. "You do not get to understand everything just because you noticed one thing," she said, not as a refusal, not as a barrier, but as a boundary. Daniel did not react defensively, did not push. He simply nodded once, accepting the terms without argument. And that, more than anything, was what changed the direction of what came next, because for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore was not trying to control the outcome. He was trying to earn it. Emily did not respond right away, and this time the silence was not empty. It was intentional, like a space she allowed to exist before deciding what belonged in it. She shifted her weight slightly, her eyes moving past Daniel for just a moment, scanning the room, checking the small details that no one else noticed. A glass half empty, a guest glancing toward the service station, a subtle signal that she had learned to read without effort. Then her attention returned to him, steady, composed. "Earning something does not mean you get it immediately," she said quietly, her voice even, not dismissive, just precise. Daniel nodded once, not pushing back, not trying to accelerate the moment. And that restraint was new, not forced, not calculated, just there. "I understand," he replied, and for once, he did not follow it with another question, did not try to fill the space with strategy or persuasion. He simply stood there, allowing the conversation to exist without control. Emily studied him for a second longer, as if confirming that what she was seeing was real, that he was not going to turn this into a negotiation, not going to reduce it into something transactional. Then she reached for the edge of the service counter, picking up a small notepad, the same kind she used for orders, flipping it open with a familiar motion. Daniel's eyes followed the movement, curious but quiet. She wrote something quickly, not numbers this time, not formulas, just a few lines, then tore the page cleanly and held it between her fingers for a moment before offering it to him. He took it without hesitation, his expression unreadable as he glanced down. The handwriting was the same, precise, controlled, but the words were different, simpler. "Tomorrow, 8:30. Same mistake. Different room." Daniel read it once, then again, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that whatever she was offering was not random, not casual, it was intentional. "What is this?" he asked, lifting his eyes back to hers. Emily did not explain immediately. She simply met his gaze, calm as ever. "An opportunity," she said. and the word carried more weight than it should have. Not because of how she said it, but because of what it implied. Daniel glanced back at the note, then around the restaurant, as if trying to place it within the structure of his world. But it did not fit neatly. It was not scheduled, not documented, not part of any plan his assistant had prepared, and that was exactly why it held his attention. "You are asking me to trust you," he said, not as a challenge, just as an observation. Emily gave the smallest shake of her head. "No," she replied softly. "I am asking you to pay attention again." The distinction landed, quiet but clear. Daniel folded the note once, carefully, not out of habit, but out of respect for something he did not fully understand yet. "And if I show up?" he asked. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in her eyes, something almost like certainty. "Then you might see why you almost signed that contract today," she said. And that was it. No elaboration, no persuasion, just a statement placed exactly where it needed to be. A server called her name softly from across the room, pulling her attention back to the present, to the rhythm she never broke. Emily stepped back, already turning away. "I have work," she added, not as an excuse, but as a fact. Daniel watched her go, the note still in his hand, the noise of the restaurant returning around him, but not in the same way as before, because now there was something else layered into it, something unresolved, something waiting, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore found himself standing in a place where the next move was not his to define, but his to decide. At 8:30 the next morning, Daniel Whitmore was already seated, and that alone would have unsettled anyone who worked with him because he was never early, never waiting, never still before a meeting began. But this was not on his calendar, not in his assistant's system, not something that could be prepared for with reports or projections. The room was smaller than the one from the day before, quieter, less polished, a private conference space tucked away from the main floor, and yet it carried the same weight, not because of who was in it, but because of what was about to be seen. A few executives were already present, their voices low, discussing figures that looked familiar, too familiar. Daniel recognized the structure immediately, the layout of the model, the assumptions, the confidence in their tone. It was the same pattern, just dressed differently. And then he saw it, not clearly at first, just a flicker of recognition, a number placed where it did not belong, a shift. So small it could be ignored, unless you were looking for it, unless you had been shown how to see it. The door opened quietly behind him, and he did not turn right away because he already knew. "Same mistake," Emily said softly, stepping into the room without hesitation, without announcement, as if she belonged there just as much as anyone else. Daniel glanced back at her, then returned his attention to the screen. "Different room," he replied, and this time, there was no irritation in his voice, no resistance, just acknowledgement. The executives paused, noticing the exchange, uncertainty flickering across their faces as they tried to understand how this woman, still in the same simple uniform, had entered a space they had spent years earning access to. Emily moved closer to the table, not rushed, not cautious, just precise. Her eyes already scanning the data, not reading it, but understanding it. "They are applying the correction too late again," she said, her tone calm. "Matter of fact," as if she were pointing out something obvious. One of the analysts frowned, defensive but unsure. "We accounted for volatility," he said, but his voice did not carry the same confidence as before. Emily shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, just adjusting the focus. "After the baseline shift," she replied, tapping lightly on the table near the projection. "That means your exposure compounds before your protection activates." Silence followed, not imposed, not forced, just natural, the kind that comes when a truth is placed exactly where it cannot be ignored. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism, but in clarity. He could see it now, not because she explained it, but because she had shown him where to look, and once you saw it, you could not unsee it. "Run it again," he said, echoing the moment from the day before. But this time, the tone was different, steadier, more certain. The analyst hesitated for only a second before adjusting the model, recalculating, verifying, and again, the numbers shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to change everything. Projected gains softening, margins tightening, risk expanding. the pattern repeating itself with quiet precision. Daniel exhaled slowly, not surprised, just confirming what he had come to understand. He turned to Emily, studying her not as an anomaly, not as a question, but as something far more valuable, perspective. "You knew this would happen," he said, and she gave a small nod, not proud, not distant, just honest. "It already did," she replied, and that was the difference, not prediction, but recognition. Daniel straightened, his decision already made before he spoke. "From now on," he said, his voice calm but carrying the same authority that once filled larger rooms. "You do not stand behind the table." A few executives shifted, unsure of what that meant, unsure of what was changing, but Daniel did not look at them. His attention remained on Emily. "You sit at it," he finished, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they disagreed, but because they understood something had just been redefined, not by title, not by status, but by clarity. Emily held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her silence said enough. She did not thank him, did not accept or decline. She simply stepped forward, just one step, and that was all it took to cross the line that had never really been about distance. And as the room settled into this new reality, quieter, more aware, Daniel Whitmore finally understood something he had spent years overlooking, that the most expensive mistakes were rarely hidden. They were simply ignored by those who believed they already knew where to look, and the people who saw them first were often the ones no one thought to ask.